Okay, we'll reconvene and we'll welcome Federated Farmers who are making a submission. When they come on screen. Welcome. We're here to receive your submission on behalf of Federated Farmers.
Thank you. Sorry, the sound isn't too great.
We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. So I'm Rachel Thomas. Thank you for hearing me this afternoon. So I have been through the supplementary planning evidence which was released, and I actually don't have anything further to add. I think that our concerns have actually been resolved, so I'm happy to take questions.
In that case, I've got no questions.
I'll be with you in a moment. I just need to go back to the updated plan provision.
Victoria's just sent a message that she can't see or hear the room. You might have accidentally dropped it.
She can see it on Facebook then. Rachel, Keith O'Val here. Since your comment saying you're happy with what's in the amended, then I've got no questions for you as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rachel Dennis Dixon. I'm just wondering, are you comfortable with the vehicle movements for roading taken from 250 to 100? Are you comfortable with that recommendation?
Sorry, I heard vehicle movements, but it's just a little bit difficult to hear the rest.
Do you want to go over?
Can you hear me now, Rachel?
That's perfect, actually. Thank you.
Thank you. What I'm wondering is if Federated Farmers are comfortable with the vehicle movements taken from 250 back to 100 per day on road?
Remembering that truck movements are even less.
And yes, truck movements are less, and of course trucks and trailers are 2 movements.
I think our preference is obviously to maintain it at the 250, just in regards to rural transport with freight and several movements throughout the day from working farms.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got,
Sorry, if I just add to that, I think that we had something in our submission. I have to refer back to it about the vehicle movements not referring specifically to primary production activities.
does that mean you want to have primary production truck movements mentioned specifically?
I think that would be the preference, yes.
So can Tina give us an update in terms of what the recommendation was on that?
Yes, I would have to go back and look through the submissions to give you a detailed response, but just from memory, there was a submission to exempt primary production vehicle movements. I can't remember in relation to what provision now. So I might have to come back to you about that detail, but I recommended to reject that submission because primary production vehicles they have the same effect as any other vehicle. I understand the reasons, but yes.
Yes, that is what your comment is. I can remember that. Look, we'll consider your submission when we deliberate. Thank you. Do you have anything else to add on behalf of Federated Farmers?
We have nothing further to add. Thank you.
In the absence of any further questions, we'll thank you for your submissions. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
So we've got till 12:30 until NZTA come up online. So I guess, Lindsay, in your hands, let us know when they do and we'll go on with the other reports, which takes us to temporary activities.
Yes, who's going to take us through the temporary activities? Oh, Jo.
That would be me. Good
Yes.
morning. Or
Morning.
good afternoon now.
Afternoon.
Okay, so I'm the author of the Section 42A report for temporary activities. My supplementary evidence was combined with Ms Carson McCall's in terms of the transport, as we had multiple submitters who had submitted on both of the chapters. I make no further changes to my chapter, given that the evidence received from submitters was in support of the recommendations in the 42A report. I can give you a brief overview of the changes made to via the 42A report, though. So amendments were made to the Objective 1 and Policy 1 to provide greater specificity for mana whenua values. A rule and supporting policy was recommended to provide for temporary network utilities in cases of emergencies or where these are associated with other temporary activities. An amendment was made to temporary Rule 3 to remove reference to the storage for farming purposes. The rule managing the demolition of structures and buildings was amended slightly to also include structures and vegetation. And there was a change to Note 1 to clarify when the temporary activities chapter takes precedence over other PDP chapters. Of note, the temporary activity chapter takes precedent over all PDP chapters with the exceptions of the ecosystems and indigenous biodiversity chapter, historic heritage, notable trees, sites of and areas of significant to Māori, and general district-wide matters, activities on the surface of water, noise, and signs. I'll take questions now.
So I guess first one, in relation to relocated buildings and the way that the rule I've interpreted it, please correct me.
Okay, so just to be clear, are you referring to rule R2 or rule R8? Okay. So rule R2 manages temporary buildings and structures associated with construction. So this is for aspects such as scaffolding or temporary site offices, which are usually in the form of a container or temporary storage. And the conditions there require that they must be located on the same site as the construction activity. They must not exceed 12 months duration or the duration of the construction project. There is an area that they cannot exceed, and also a requirement for them to be removed 2 weeks after the completion of the activity. So this rule is just in relation to buildings that may be required on site whilst a construction activity is being undertaken.
And I guess what confused me is that the heading for R8 is a rogue heading on a page by itself, and therefore skimming through stuff, I didn't see that heading sitting there. So yes, that does cover the relocated buildings. So when someone is bringing a relocated building in, there'll be some provisions put in place under the Building Act, and it includes that work must start in a certain amount of time, and I think there's usually under the Act a time for work to be done. Are we actually duplicating the provisions of the Building Act with the requirements we've got there?
I'd need to review the Building Act in detail to confirm that, but given the discussions that we've had on this topic previously in previous hearing streams, the Building Act does not manage the relocation of buildings to the extent of providing for pre-inspection reports or similar. But I can do a comparison exercise between the two if you would like. As we've discussed previously, inclusion of the of a relocated buildings rule in the district plan is so that we can manage the likes of amenity and character within a zone, is there as a belts and braces approach. If we've got sort of buildings that are relocated to sites and then left and not actually reinstated.
I guess in some respects it's no different to new homes that the company goes bust and they're sitting there for a long time as well. But there's no submissions on it. Rule 9, what is demolition of vegetation?
Demolition of building structures and vegetations, in my mind, is the removal of vegetation. So the cutting down of trees, removal of hedges, similarly to removing buildings and structures.
By the smile on your face, I think you acknowledge that maybe a different word might be needed as part of that rule.
Yeah, so the submission for this, so this came about from a submission, and I understand where the submitter is coming from in terms of the way that the plan is structured, and that if you don't provide for activities, then they can default to non-complying. So as much as I was not wanting to include vegetation, I understand their point of view in terms of not wanting to default to non-complying. I think you do have to consider, though, that if there's not specific rules, so for instance, the Indigenous Biodiversity chapter has got rules around removal of vegetation, and that takes precedent over this chapter. If you were needing to clear a site in order to build a house or perform a permitted activity, then the activity of constructing a building or a residential activity would encompass removing vegetation in that respect. But if you wanted it clear, black and white in the rules, that's why it's been included in this rule.
Okay, let me introduce the little twist. Demolition is shown in italics, therefore it is a definition at the front of the plan. The definition at the front of the plan for demolition relates to heritage structures. So that rule only applies to buildings and structures that are heritage structures.
If you could just give me a moment, I'm just going to read the definition.
Yeah.
Okay. I wonder, and this may be a legal question, the definition says in relation to historic heritage means the complete destruction of a building or structure. So arguably, if you're utilising that term when dealing with a historic heritage building, that's its meaning. But can the term not also be used in relation to another activity? I don't... Demolition.
I'd suggest where it's a demolition and it doesn't have a note as being specifically referenced to particular rules, then it can be applied wherever the word demolition is found in the plan. Oh, except in relation to the historic buildings.
No, this is just in relation to buildings generally.
Yeah. To be clear, it would be helpful to have a note underneath it saying the context for where it is to apply it, or to bring it within the relevant chapter solely if it was to be limited. Because if it is one word, then the general expectation would be the definition would apply throughout.
Yeah. And the same applies to the word restoration in number 4 of the matters of discretion. Again, that's got similar sorts of wording referring to heritage. So we can ask for some clarification on that as part of the follow-up from the hearing.
So, yeah, in a reply.
Yeah. So returning to demolition of vegetation for a moment, is removal of a commercial forestry lot or a wood lot caught by that rule?
My initial thought would be that demolition as a word doesn't generally capture that type of activity. It would be it would be a creative application of it.
Yeah, so it's because vegetation has been added to the rule heading. So it refers to demolition of building structures and vegetation. And I guess the other legal issue is that since we have rules that actually relate to the removal of trees that are shown on a register, that would to me imply that if the tree isn't shown on the register, then there's no rules that need apply to it.
Perhaps it would be helpful if we can deal with it in a reply. So take on board your comments, and certainly in terms of the definition can assist on a legal, in terms of legal framework, and then in terms of the content and substance of the role in planning terms, then Joe can feed in some comments on that, if that's okay.
Okay. The next one might be in the same category. If we go to rule temp R1, so temporary events are permitted where within a purpose-built building or is held on council land, or the maximum number of people is 1,000, and it is doesn't exceed 3 days. Now, we have ors and ands. Do we actually have a dividing line after number 2 in terms of the rules relating to things in permanent structures or on council land, and the things that follow are really standards? Or do you have to comply with every clause in there? So how does one interpret that rule?
Okay, so If you comply with point 1, as in you're held in a purpose-built building, then that's sort of where you finish reading the rule. If your event is on council-owned land, then you comply and you stop. Or other events have to not exceed 1,000 people and then comply with the duration, the number of the site, any calendar year. So once you comply with one, you don't need to move on.
So what I'm suggesting is that you have 1 and 2 that are fine. 3 is a heading for other events with A, B and C.
Yep.
So
Yep,
it's clear
I can-
that they apply to the other events.
Yep.
I'm just would like to seek clarification. So the biodiversity chapter, just speaking about 10(9), just let you finish
Yeah,
your
I'm ready.
train of thought there. The biodiversity chapter must be adhered to, and it takes precedent over 10(9), so that it doesn't mean that any notable trees or natural biodiversity can be demolished, I guess is the right word.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. So would it be worthwhile having another point there in point 6 that you must comply? Any vegetation clearance must comply with that biodiversity chapter?
Where do you
Point
propose
5,
that?
sorry, it would be 5.
I think the note at the start of the chapter is probably the preferable place to advise plan users of other rules that are applicable.
Yeah, I accept that.
So what does the term take precedence mean, i.e. comes first? Does it need to be also stated that those rules in those other chapters do not apply in this case? Because there's nothing that actually says those rules don't apply, it just says these take precedence, i.e. they come first and then the other rules come second.
My interpretation of takes precedence means that this rule applies instead of those. However, if you disagree and think it needs to be clearer, then you can make amendments to that fact. I don't think it would change the overall aim of what we're trying to achieve. But if you would prefer to use a different word.
And the same thing's going to come up when we have the hearing on utilities as to whether that section applies over everything else. And I guess whatever wording we come up with that one, as long as we're consistent with it here. And I guess for Shelley, is a note sufficient to say these rules apply over everything else? Right. Objective 1 has 2 very different issues in it with the rewording. The first is that temporary activities are planned located to minimise effects on amenity values, people and activities, and the natural environment. To me, that's one objective that's almost standalone. And I wonder whether the rest of it, the values of mana whenua hold, etc., are recognised and provided for, is a second one, a second objective. i.e. is there value in splitting it in two now that you've changed the wording?
Potentially there is value. I think the second sentence, though, discusses or it provides that specificity that we've discussed in terms of mana whenua values, and that's come up a lot during the hearing streams. So where the first part of the objective discusses adverse effects on amenity values, people and their activities, and the natural environment, and then the second sentence gives you that further detail in terms of the values that mana whenua hold. So it could be split into two, but ideally I would keep it as one because it is providing that further detail on the expectations and values of mana whenua, which the objective overall is concerned with.
Should that also have provided for? Should it just not finished recognised in the Temp 1 objective?
Well, my copy does.
Hmm?
Well, my copy does say provided for.
Yes, I'm just thinking, why should it say provided for?
Because it's a Section 6 matter.
Right. Is that the answer? It's Section 6 matter.
Yes.
Right, we'll just hold the discussion on temporary activities, and we'll go back to hearing submissions from NZTA.
Hello.
Right, good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon.
We're ready to hear your submission.
Thank you.
And by way of introduction, were you listening?
My name is Helen Dempster, and I'm a planner in the environmental planning team at the New Zealand Transport Agency. I'm joined today by NZTA Safety Engineer Glenn Connolly. Have you got a copy of our evidence in front of you?
Yes, we do. And did you listen to any of the discussion that we had this morning over the transport section?
No, sorry, I haven't. Glenn, did you?
No, not all of them. I picked up bits and pieces.
So I understand that our evidence is being taken as read. So rather than discuss all of the points raised in my evidence, I would just like to summarise two key matters which relate to digital signs and the changes sought by NZTA to the state highway designation where that involves privately owned land. So the first key matter of concern I'd like to address is the permitted activity status of digital signs in Gore's proposed district plan. Oh, are you able to hear me okay? I just see that the hearing administrator's walking. All good to carry on?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Oh, yeah, good. My evidence on digital signs starts on page 5, and there I suggest that digital signs of all sizes which are visible from a state highway should instead have a restricted discretionary activity status to enable case-by-case and site-specific assessment of all of the environmental variables present at the sign location at that point in time, so that the safety risks presented by the digital sign can be identified and appropriately managed through a resource consent process. I'll hand over to Glenn to summarise why this approach is appropriate.
Hello, my name's Glenn Connolly and I'm Senior Engineer, Safety Engineer for the New Zealand Transport Agency, Waka Kotahi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
My qualifications and experience are detailed in paragraphs 2 and 3 of my evidence, and I'll take my evidence as read. I've been asked to present evidence on behalf of NZTA, Waka Kotahi, given my knowledge and experience in dealing with digital billboards. Digital billboards provide third-party information designed by nature to stand out and capture attention. Naturally, distracting a driver could be a concern in regard to safety. It's difficult to identify the effect of advertising and crash data as they fall within the broader category of distractions or inattention. Driver distraction or inattention, however, is a significant factor in crashes, with suggestions its impact may be underreported. Whilst drivers can focus on the driving task ignoring distractions, this is not always the case. And this has led to some research and studies which have been undertaken to understand the human response. And this shows that driver performance is impacted by digital billboards. For example, a driver's position within their lane can be affected. It reduces following distance, can increase response time when advertising changes, and drivers more often overlook official road signs, for example. Guidance thus recommends that digital billboards in conflict areas and or where road users may be at risk of serious injury are controlled. The revised provisions of the district plan subsequent to submissions generally avoids digital billboards in high-speed areas, which is consistent with good practice, but not entirely. The revised provisions now restrict signs and billboards at or near intersections and pedestrian crossings and official signs. This would preclude most of the urban area from having a digital sign as a permitted activity. I looked into the effect of the proximity to intersections as one of the provisions that might trigger the need for consent. If you look at figure 1 of my statement of evidence, it shows for the one provision, the proximity to intersection, that about 95% of the state highway would be precluded from having a digital billboard given its proximity to an intersection as a permitted activity. And looking at the other provisions such as proximity to digital to official signs and pedestrian crossings, it would further reduce the ability of a digital billboard to be approved as a permitted activity. Compliance with good practice and guidance as reflected in the revised provisions of the district plan is not straightforward either. It often involves a detailed understanding of the site, the road environment and potential risks, particularly for vulnerable road users in an urban environment, which could be pedestrians and cyclists, but now includes things like scooters and a whole lot of other raft of vulnerable users that occur in the urban environment. The assessment of compliance is not simple, and it's my opinion that the effects of the digital build are best considered holistically in context with the environment, whereby the risks can be balanced with conditions set as appropriate. The time the message is displayed, or the dwell time, for example, may be able to be increased to offset an identified risk. There was a suggestion that smaller signs or partially visible signs may have less impact. It's not quite that simple. Larger signs may be more easily read than smaller ones, so may be less of a distraction. A partially visible sign may also hold the driver's attention whilst they try and work out what part of the message is actually obscured and what it's intended to say. This further demonstrates the complexity of assessing the effects of digital billboards. In summary, there's a risk of distraction contributing to a serious crash, albeit it may be a low risk of the crash occurring. Research indicates that driver performance can be affected. Guidance suggests prudent caution, and as assessing the effects is complex and involved, I consider it as best considered in detail by experienced and qualified professionals. That sort of concludes my verbal comments. If you wish, I can answer questions now or once Helen has completed her submission.
Yes, well, if anybody's got any questions, I prefer to do it now. I have no questions.
Is it the intent that digital signs inside the windows of shops is caught by the rule?
Helen, is that one best answered by you?
Yeah, I think the intention is that it's signs that are visible from the state highway. So if they're directed towards state highway motorists, they can still cause that distraction issue.
My experience is possibly it would depend on how digital signs are defined. Signs that are within shop windows and perpendicular to the road are often hard to see by traffic passing by, so they may not be captured. So I think it's worth discussing exactly how that is given effect to and what might actually occur on site.
Good morning. There are a number of signs on farming activities for health and safety reasons. So how would you suppose that that they could be compliant?
Is this referring to digital signs on farming activities? Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Just farming activities, you have stop signs, you have the amount of people that can be on the property or who can be on the property, you have signs for dairy truck crossings, dock crossings, you have a number of signs in farming activities. And a lot of those are for health and safety reasons.
They might come under official signs. I'd have to look at the definition, but stock signs would be a temporary sign. I would have thought if stock are being shifted along the state highway. Sorry, I haven't prepared for a question about something that's not a digital sign.
Yes, I think we're focusing on digital or advertising, third-party advertising, as opposed to necessary signs for the operation and safety of a specific site. Often those are directed at a specific stream and they don't necessarily need to be directed toward the traffic or compete for drivers' attention, for example. They're often site-related, and I would say most of the time they would be inside the site or approaching the access as opposed to directly at passing traffic. That's if I understand the question correctly.
Thank you.
I think that's dealt with digital signs. Do you have anything else you wish to raise?
Time for some questions then. I'll go to Glenys first, if you're ready, Glenys.
I'm just a little concerned about the number of traffic movements on highways and roads being reduced from 250 to 100 vehicle movements per day. Can you explain how you come up with that number when I'm thinking of other districts where traffic numbers would be a lot higher than in the Gore district?
Sure, so that 100 vehicle per day, movement per day value comes from the New Zealand Transport Agency Planning Policy Manual, which has been in existence since 2007. I'm not too sure, I wasn't involved in drafting that manual at that time, so I'm not too sure where that 100 value has been derived from. Work is being done to reconsider that whole chapter, but it's not completed yet. So that figure might be subject to change, but at this point it's 100, and I would have expected that would have been based upon evidence at that time.
Thank you.
As a result of a submission from NZTA, there's a rule that's been included saying that signs fronting highways should not be located within 100 metres of an intersection. Well, that will include the entire Gore commercial area in the main street. Is that the intent? Because there's shops in the middle of the shopping centre that are within 100 metres of an intersection.
Is that a permitted activity criteria, I think? So it means that if someone was seeking to have a sign within 100 metres of an intersection, that would require a resource consent?
So that applies. Yeah, so that applies to all of the shops in the commercial area of Gore require a resource consent for a sign. Is that reasonable?
The intent of that setback is so that the effects of the sign on the state highway users can be assessed and managed to make sure that it doesn't cause a safety issue. So I guess that's my comment in regard to that. Glenn, do you have something you'd like to contribute there too?
Yes, so the criteria is based on digital billboards and third-party advertising, so advertising that's out of context for the environment. I think our submission was based on that. So the criteria is set as 100 metres, and that's what's shown in figure 1 of my diagram. It does actually preclude 95% of the environment in the urban area. The reason for that is at the intersection there's an elevated risk of conflict and an elevated risk that a crash will occur. So it needs further assessment. In regard to your question, I think our submission is relating to digital billboards as opposed to advertising associated with a permitted activity within the commercial area, which would have its own criteria. Helen, is there any difference in the criteria for permitted advertising for an existing activity, a retail activity, as opposed to a digital billboard? Is there a difference between the two?
That 100 metre, that proximity to the intersection was taken again from our planning policy manual, and I don't think it did actually distinguish between a digital sign and a non-digital sign.
Another rule refers to a chevron sign. What is a chevron sign?
That's a curve indicator, so that's usually in a rural environment. So chevron is those triangular shaped, or the greater than, less than sort of symbol. You might have a chevron board that has 4 of them with an advisory speed sign, then you have individual ones going around a curve. So the reason for that is you don't want drivers distracted where there's a high demand to negotiate a curve at speed.
Okay, if we go back to one moment for the volumes of traffic that are permitted, so it's come down to the equivalent of 100 vehicles per day. We have a report with input from Mark Gregory and also comment from our roading manager, Murray Hasler. And I'd like to hear both their views while we've got NZTA online in terms of the numbers that are there, because there appears to be some differing views. So I'm wondering, Mark, if we can start with you, please, in terms of what your views are in terms of what's being promoted.
Certainly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So my opinion on the matter is that 100 equivalent car movements, so we're talking 100 equivalent car movements per day, those tend to be a lower threshold compared to some other plans, and each vehicle type can be given an ECM equivalent, so 100 ECMs could be the equivalent of 5 truck movements per day, which, in my opinion, that is a little on the onerous side. I'm of the opinion that it's traffic intensity, it's the amount of traffic that moves sort of within a shorter period of time, usually measured in volume per hour, that's usually associated with network effect. So in some of the plans, they might say 250 vehicles per day or 50 vehicles per hour, for example. And I do also concede that each circumstance has its own, each case has its own circumstances, individual circumstances. So there's probably no perfect answer to this, but yeah, I would be of the opinion that 100 ECMs is quite low and would capture a lot more activities that might not be generating network effect, if that makes sense.
I'd like a comment from somebody. Typically in farming activity, seasonal farming activity, and I'm thinking of harvesting, you may well have 30, 35 truck movements over the course of a day and on a secondary road. Now, that's farming being a permitted activity. Surely you're not suggesting that that is going to require consent.
Is that a question for me? Sorry?
Yes, and anybody else who wants to give me something that is might be practical. Thank you.
I would suggest, I mean, in the NZTA Planning Policy Manual, the 100 ECM per day is the threshold for a change in a vehicle crossing formation standard. So that's that 100 informs that the standard that the vehicle crossing is formed to an appropriate standard to not adversely affect the state highway. So it's more than just the number of vehicle movements. There's knock-on effects there in terms of making sure that the vehicle crossing has an appropriate size, radius, that sort of thing, widening to accommodate the number of vehicle movements, including heavier vehicles.
Also, the 100 vehicle movements is set as a reasonably low threshold because it covers all state highways where the receiving environment might change. So it has to cover everything, even the higher ones. So it really does depend on your context where that threshold is set. I know the volumes are getting up in the middle of town, for example, but they may be a lot lesser in the surrounding road environments. The other thing is, in terms of your peak movements, the ECMs and the planning and policy manual is taken as an average over the year, so it would take those peaks out, for example.
So the way the rule's written, it just says on a daily basis. So what you've highlighted is a note that I've made that it's taken over an extended period of time, just not one day when you exceed. So 30 vehicle movements for farming purposes, even if you averaged it over the week. So I think there might be a tweak that's required to the rule. But to go back to the 100 figure, Murray, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this too, please.
So I looked at it in a more raw perspective, just equating it to the average number of movements per household, basically, which is normally accepted around about 8 vehicle movements per residential lot. So 100 movements per day would be looking at 12 to 13 houses, whereas 250 would be looking at 31 residential lots. I just considered that the 250 would be, in my view, a more reasonable limit rather than the 100 per day.
Taking into account too, like a truck in a trailer is 2 vehicle movements as well.
I didn't really look at the combination of vehicles. It was really just looking at that from a residential point of view, I suppose.
I think the rule that we've got applies to all roads. Should there be a difference between state highways and other roads, or the important connectors and other roads?
I think that would be a reasonable thing to do, and with the classifications of roads that we've got, either the ONRC, the one net road classification, or the ONF, which is the one network framework, are 2 classification systems that could be used to easily accommodate that difference in level, looking at other questions, particularly site distances, which is it's not part of this conversation, but I'm suggesting that the one network road classification would be the better option to use. We've got that in our RAM system, so it's easily accessed information, but it also it is a wee bit more fine-tuned, I think, and it doesn't go down to too low a level, which the ONF would do.
So I see that Glenn's got his hand up, so I'll come to you first, Glenn, but then I'd be interested in some feedback from the other two that we've got online in terms of splitting the rule, so applying to state highway or main roads and a rule applying to other roads. So start with Glenn and then to the other two.
Okay, just a quick comment to help in terms of context for the 100 vehicles per day, or SEM. Correctly with the residential property, it generates between 8 to 10 vehicle movements per day. So the 100 vehicles per day, for example, might be that threshold where you might have around 10 houses, 10, 12 houses, which is normally where you tip over from a private development or a private road to possibly looking at a public road, with a lot of thresholds being sort of 7 to 8 houses being a tip over for a public road, or possibly around the 10, 12 sort of area. There'll be a local context for that as well, but that context, that threshold and reasoning just might help in terms of understanding.
Just to comment on that, locally we're applying it's either 5 or 6 lots, units to tip over to the between the private and public road, so we're less than the 10 that you are referring to currently.
So Helen, from your perspective, splitting it, you're comfortable with that, no doubt? You're just concerned about the highway?
Yes, yes, absolutely comfortable to use like the ONF as the means of dividing that.
Just a question.
Oh, sorry, can I just hear from
Sure.
Mark first? And Mark, your view on splitting it?
Yeah, I see the logic, though. I'd be keen to point out what's being controlled by this particular rule, and we talked about the 100 ECM. Helen mentioned that it's around the thresholds for access design, and I note that access design is managed by, there's an alternative rule in place to manage access. So the high trip generate the network effects, and I guess it's a trade-off, isn't it? If we split it, then we're adding to the plan. I don't see there's any harm in doing it. I agree that it there's no harm in doing it, but is it necessary? Or are we just making the chapter slightly longer?
Murray, a question for you. We had some supplementary evidence this morning. Minimum distances to signs depending as determined by speed. In a 50k area, minimum distance was 80 metres. At 60k's, it was 55 metres. There's obviously something not quite right there. Would you expect that to be changed or reversed? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not quite familiar with the with that information that you're referring to.
Yeah, it was in the signs. Have you got that, Keith?
Yeah, just looking it up. So it actually comes from the NZTA submission, and the minimum distance between signs on sites adjoining the state highway. So what's been included in the staff recommendation is a table that says when the posted speed limit is 50k, the minimum distance between signs must be 80 metres. When the posted speed limit is 60k, the minimum distance between signs is 55 metres. So at the higher speed, there is a lesser amount, and it doesn't seem to be logical.
No, that would definitely be the case. In our temporary traffic management requirements, the visibility to signs is dictated by speeds, and the higher the speed, the greater distance viewing of the sign is required.
So Helen, what I've just quoted came from the submission from NZTA. Can you clarify, please?
Yeah, sorry, look, I'm just looking at that now, and you raise a valid point. I'm questioning why at higher speeds the distance would be reducing. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you here and now. I'll need to go away and look at that.
I confirm it should increase.
Okay, the next one applies to a table that shows distances related or to the 85 percentile speed of vehicles, and it would appear to assume that the 85 percentile vehicle is travelling faster than the posted speed limit, but we're reminded from the courts that we have to assume people act legally when they're interpreting the rules, and it's quite possible in some cases that the 85 percentile speed of the vehicle is actually less than the posted speed limit. So in terms of providing, is it the distance between accesses? Tina, which rule is that applying to, please?
So the sight distances for vehicle crossings would be related to the vehicle crossing rule,
Right.
which
So that came from NZTA's submission as well, did it not?
yes, from memory, that's it, isn't it?
Yeah. So Murray, can you help?
This might come from Federated Farmers, I think, is it? So we're looking at table S6. Is that where you're looking
Yes,
at?
correct.
So that's in the transport section.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yes.
Right.
Yep. So this is the distance that vehicles approaching an access way should be able to see someone waiting to exit or enter that particular access way, and so there's two columns there. So it has been split, as was being suggested in the previous discussion, between roads of higher significance than others. And I was having a look at this before coming in, and I mentioned earlier in the discussion that possibly it may be better to stick with the one network road classification rather than the one network framework, because if you go to the one network framework, which is based on place, you capture roads that have got very low traffic volumes within the rural connectors classification, whereas the regional and primary collector roads categories are a very small list, and I don't think it is reasonable to bring in those secondary collectors into the tougher category.
Okay, I understand that. So that's something that needs to be looked at. But the whole column of 85th percentile, Joe Public is not going to know what that is, and I question whether it provides enough certainty in any case.
It actually provides probably more certainty than we had previously, in that we're actually adding on the 10. We're assuming that that the 85th percentile is above the posted speed limit, and so unlike the table in the current document, which had two sections, so we had a section where the sight distances were based on a measured speed at 85th percentile. So that brought up one column of sight distances required, and the other table was, or the other column was where there was no actual speeds measured to provide that 85th percentile. What's being suggested here is that an assumption be made that the 85th percentile is, or the actual operating speed on the road, which is the 85th percentile, includes that extra 10 kilometres per hour. So you only get one set of sight distances for each of the two categories of road, the regional and the high volume roads and the other roads. Anyone looking at this table, all they need to know is which what the road's posted at. So is it a 50k road or a 100k road or whatever, and whether it is what its classification is, whether it's a primary collector or it's another type of road. So it simplifies that process for people trying to ascertain what sight distances will be required in the situation. Hopefully that makes sense.
Helen, question for you. In your submission, you've got maps here showing land in private ownership that aren't in the legal road parcel. So you were going back to ask the private landowners whether they approved of this land being used in that parcel. Has that been done yet, or is still to happen?
No, that hasn't been done. We would look to consult with them directly once we look to acquire the land, but so these encroachments into private property are historical. They go back to when those highways were actually formed however many decades ago. I don't know why the highways were constructed where they were such that they encroached into private land, but the landowners can't access the bits of the land. They fall within the state highway corridor. Typically there's a fence there that prevents them from being able to use it presently and going forward. This occurs a lot along the state highway network throughout New Zealand, and NZTA seeks to correct these encroachments by designating those bits of land for state highway purposes through district planning processes like this. But there's other steps in the process around formally acquiring the land from people, but by including these 8 areas of private encroachment into our submission, that's allowed those landowners the opportunity, should they want to further submit in opposition to our proposal to designate them.
So you won't be, you won't be approaching them personally to include that land?
We would, when we get to the point of looking to acquire it, to purchase it, which is done by our property team, but there's numerous examples of this throughout the country, and acquiring it is subject to funding, and they're prioritised as well. So at this point, we haven't got to the point of acquiring this land, but I would assume that the landowners would be aware that there is an encroachment issue if they had records of their land that they'd get on their title, which would show the layout of their land. To the best of my knowledge, they haven't approached NZTA about the encroachment issue, but these are a suite of just the ones within the Gore district, but there's examples throughout the country of similar encroachments that are being rectified as we come to them and as we have funding to acquire the land.
We have with us Council's legal advisor, and I'd like to turn to her for the advice that she's given us in relation to this.
Good afternoon. So, have you seen the legal submissions online, NZTA people?
No, I haven't. Sorry. And Sorry, you're coming through kind of a bit garbled. I'm only picking up some of what you're saying, sorry.
So the legal submissions online address two matters relating to NZTA. They were put up online, and one of them we discussed at the hearing this morning, which I understand you didn't view. So perhaps it would be helpful for me just to quickly address those. So in the legal submissions in relation to the transport chapter, it talks about reference to the NZTA Planning Policy Manual. And specifically, Ms Dempster, your suggestion that it might be able to refer to future revisions of that document, and there's a legal basis for council suggesting that can't be followed, and there's a reference there to clause 31 of which addresses documents by reference. The second point relates to the discussion you've been having with the Commissioner in relation to NZTA designations and revisions to mapping over private land. Excuse me. And I heard you say that the fact that it was raised through a submission would be sufficient to give those landowners notice. And in my submission, that isn't appropriate, because the designation process actually requires an earlier step, which is sufficient notice given to those owners of the designation, and that's way back prior to notification. And I think Tina addressed it briefly in your evidence. Yeah. So and that was so in the context of designations in particular, the scope doesn't come from submissions; it comes from correct following of the designation process and notice to owners and adjoining owners.
So, Helen, any response to that?
Look, I think I'll probably need to read the legal submission and look at the clause referred to there, but I can appreciate that it would be ideal to actually have the landowners made explicitly aware of the intention to designate part of their land. Look, I don't disagree with what the lawyer has said.
So where we are in the process, we've got a good 6 months before we're issuing decisions, and designations can be done by limited notification. So I guess I'm seeking the advice of planner and lawyer here. In terms of procedurally, there's probably nothing stopping us doing a limited notification to the affected property owners and giving them the opportunity of lodging a submission if they see fit. Either Tina or Shelley, is that a logical way to progress?
It's perhaps something that we can comment on in a reply, but the procedural issue arises in terms of initial notification, not in relation to this sort of back-end part of the process. But certainly if we can look at how that might be resolved with NZTA, and potentially if NZTA did do the work and consult with owners and they gave written confirmation they had no concerns, we might be able to do a workaround. But it's a technical procedural point. Sorry, that's my job. But that's what we can come back to in reply, perhaps.
So is it NZTA who have to write to the landowner or council? Because if NZTA write, it's a consultation type letter, whereas if council does it, it provides an opportunity for a submission.
Yeah, sure. So in clause 5 of the first schedule, it sets out what we need to do when we notify the plan. So there is the kind of standard notification matters, and then there's an additional clause when someone is directly affected, which would apply to designations. So because it's the proposed plan process, and this has been raised through submissions, we weren't able to directly or notify directly affected landowners because we didn't know about this, because it's a later addition. So we haven't been able to complete that as part of that process. Whether we can use a different process to be able to incorporate it, I'd have to look into that.
Because it's a modification to a designation that's existing, not a new designation.
Correct. Yes.
So, the old 1, 2, 3, can't remember.
181, I think. Yeah, but if it's okay, I'd rather provide a right to reply, so I get a chance to have a look into it.
We'll normally after the hearings we issue a minute asking for a reply within a certain time frame. I think we might do that one separately so that it's given some priority.
Yes, sure.
Just a question for you, Shelley. So that will mean perhaps surveying and title changes, so that, which would be a cost, of course.
I think that was probably my question to NZTA, because I don't understand exactly the scope of the mapping change. So it might be 1 metre, it might be 10 metres, I'm not sure. And perhaps, so the original maps were sitting over an area this big, and then they've changed slightly and they come out over new areas of private land. So if it's only half a metre, maybe NZTA would be satisfied to proceed based on the originally notified mapping. So it may be a call for NZTA as well to assess the extent of difference and whether or not it's an issue that they want to push, given that it would require a workaround. And then having identified that extent of area, then we can look at that. In terms of survey, I wouldn't have thought that that was necessary. That's the type of thing that would happen if there was a purchase process perhaps pursued by NZTA. The mapping is done by means of a magic I don't actually understand, which
Yes.
Tina's probably better versed to speak to.
Yeah, so the designation, I mean, they often follow property boundaries, but they don't always need to do that. It's just another spatial mapping layer. So NZTA has provided us the original mapping layer, and as I understand, would also provide us with the updated version if that was what was being adopted. So it's just a mapping exercise. It's not actually purchasing land as part of the designation process. That's a different process. A designation, well, you could say it's kind of like an easement or a type of zoning that goes across someone's land, yeah.
So Helen, do you have an understanding of how much land we're talking about in these cases?
Some of it's really minor. I included examples appended to my evidence, so if I can just turn through to it. So it varies, but Appendix 2 includes those 8 parcels. So that's Appendix 2 starting on page 20 of my evidence. The first one there you'll see is quite long and skinny, but it's about 266 square metres. Others, the next one's only 18 square metres, 488 square metres, that's the third one. Then the next one's just over 9 square metres, about 12 square metres, 25 square metres, 57, and then 151. So variable.
So picking up on the legal question, wasn't necessarily the total area that's involved, although that in some respects is a good indicator. It's more the width of it, and when you consider that the width of a line on some of our planning maps is probably 3-4 metres, then some of those changes that are there won't even show up as a change on our planning maps. So I guess the panel can have a chat about it, but one option that's available to us, I guess, is to come back to you in terms of looking at the scale of our maps, how many of these actually do need to change, Are they changes of significance that will show up on a map, or just administrative type changes that you need to sort out with the affected landowner? So that's something we can come back to you on once we've had a bit more of a discussion. So I think that's all from the NZTA team. I'd like the council advisors to stay online and Murray to stay, because I want to have a talk about bylaw versus district plan. So to Helen and Glenn, thank you.
Thank you for your time. Could I just jump in before NZTA go? Apologies. So sorry, hi Helen, Glenn, hi Roberta, I was the author of the science chapter, and sorry, just around the discussion about the minimum spacing distance, I've got to apologise because clearly I've made a bit of a stuff up with the tables. So just in terms of that table, actually that first separation distance should be 50 metres. That was what was quoted in the NZTA separation, not 80 metres as I have it. So I apologise, I quoted it incorrectly in my section 42A report, which is then fed through to my appendix 1 of my supplementary evidence. So that should clear up any confusion with that, and apologies for getting that wrong.
Yeah, thank you.
Ready? Bye. Thanks, folks.
So we've still got the council advisors and Murray here, and we were having a discussion this morning about the transfer of some of the material from the bylaw into the district plan, and I guess some of my questions were in terms of the practicality or the way that things are approached. So Murray, from your point of view, at present we've got the bylaw with some standards in it, both in terms of design and thicknesses of materials, etc., etc. If people are wanting to deviate from that, what's the process that they go through at present from your end?
So currently there is a dispensation process described in the Code of Practice, in the Subdivision and Land Development Bylaw towards the back of that document. If there is a dispensation being requested or possibly being recommended by staff, we should be using that process that's described, and we have had a number of examples where either the CEO or the general manager of critical assets has agreed to that dispensation. So it's basically escalated, I suppose, as per the process described.
So are you aware of what it's proposed to bring into the district plan?
In general, yes. Yep.
And are you comfortable that things like the thickness of the concrete and the turning heads and other things are appropriate in the district plan rather than the bylaw?
Yes, I'm not uncomfortable about it. I have been aware that that's been proposed for quite some time and been involved in the process. Yeah, I haven't got any too many qualms about it.
Okay, now I'm hopeful someone can show you page 19 of the updated plan provisions that shows, the headings on the page before, separation of vehicle crossings from intersections and other vehicle crossings. So on page 9 there's a picture with some letters, M, K, N for Neville. What does the N for Neville stand for?
Yeah, so N is the separation distance between two vehicle accesses to a property, blah, blah, blah.
So where does that show up in the table?
Currently, it doesn't show in the table that I'm looking at on page 19.
Is this an essential component that needs to be there?
Sorry, if I could look into this in a little bit more detail. It was a long time since these rules were drafted, and it might be somewhere else. But if that's okay, I would, yeah, it would just give me the opportunity to go back and have a look.
Yeah, I was hoping that Murray might be able to give you some guidance here to help through the process.
Yes, so that N is something that is probably very often is not complied with. Which indicates to me that the relevance of it is low. So that's probably my primary comment on that. Just, yep.
Okay, Mark, is there anything in this discussion that's relevant for you?
I don't know. I'm afraid I can't cast any more insights into the diagram myself, but I can remain present if you like, if there is anything that does come up where I can assist.
No, probably not. That's fine. Yeah, Murray.
Thank you.
So something that often crops up with subdivisions is where an access is actually shared. So that you just wonder about the relevance again of N in the process. The only reason I can think of for enforcing N is to have low volumes at each of those accesses. Often, or a lot of our particularly rural accesses are side by side on either side of the internal boundary fence, and I'm unaware of any problems that's caused, but as I said earlier, a number of subdivisions over recent years, and probably for many years, have been shared accesses. So you may get up to five lots currently that we allow as a private right of way, all coming into that one access way. So it again undermines the relevance of the separation distance in between accesses.
Okay, so it sounds as though Tina and Murray need to have some talkies, and if there is a need to include it, what process are we able to use, but we'll come back to you both on that.
No, I don't think there's anything that comes to mind that hasn't been covered that concerns me.
Thanks, Murray.
Okay.
Malcolm, would you like to come and give your submission? Yeah, that'll be the temporary activities.
Good afternoon. I'm not sure I even need to be here, but you guys can give me some feedback on that. So I'm Nathan Barker, representing JBNZ. So we represent over 3,500 jet boaters nationally, and here to talk about temporary activities. So essentially we support the plan because it gives provision for organised events such as our jet boat club days, albeit with controls in place to mitigate any risks to the environment. And we feel that those events contribute positively to the community. So I'm not sure if I need to be here or not, but we were told that we should, even if we support, that we should put our names down anyway. So,
yep. It's good to be involved. Thank you very much. Because if you're not involved and things change, you wouldn't be informed. So thank you for taking the time. If you're in support of the temporary activities section as it's drafted presently, I don't have any questions for you. Anybody else any questions?
We have about 20 different piles of paper here. Just allow me a moment just to find the right one, please. There's an area south of Mataura that I think has provision for you guys to uplift the speed limits on a regular basis. Is that still in force?
Yes, once a year for a month. Yep, that's correct. It goes down to, actually I'd have to check that, to be honest. I can't recall off the top of my head. But yes.
So how many people and how many boats turn up for that sort of thing? What sort of vehicle numbers are we talking about?
Okay, typically around the 10 or 11 dozen, yeah. Small scale stuff. Yeah, normally sort of good river access in different sites. Yeah, we might get 20 odd boats turn up on a one-off day if the weather's nice.
So it only lasts one day?
Yep. Our events are only one day normally, so yep.
So that would occur above Gore too, on the Mataura.
Yep. So we get we apply for speed upliftings for once again one day events. So we had last weekend we had one from Kewen's Bridge at Ardlassa. They boated up to Eyre Creek. So yeah, for that one day event, I think there might have been 9 boats on that one, and so there's 9 vehicles come in, park on the river, bank on the end of the road down there, launch the boats, and then up out of there.
So for our planning advisors, what rules apply to those activities?
We have a chapter for activities on the surface of water, and the jet boating activities discussed there are covered in that chapter.
And that's coming up for hearing next month?
The month after? 7.
Yeah, activities on the surface of water is hearing stream 7.
So there's likely to be some things in there that will impact on you. So if that's 7, that's November. So about 4 weeks from now, there will be a report coming out that you'll need to have a look at, and that's likely to be of more interest to you specifically. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Also, I think there could be a couple of your submissions on the noise chapter as well. So you would have got notified that reports, I think, went out for that yesterday. So yeah, that's probably just another one to just take note of. You can always, if you didn't want to make the trip, you can provide written submissions to be addressed at the hearing, but obviously completely up to you.
So what you've done today is set the scene a little bit in terms of the issues that are coming up later, which is helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we've got a consultant coming down who's very familiar with the hearing processes to speak on the activities on the surface of water, because obviously that is our biggest chapter. So yeah, I appreciate your time with that one. That'd be great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we've still got temporary activities and the designations to go through, and then I want to hear in terms of the legal view in terms of the bylaw and the district plan issue as an intro. How are you guys going? Do you want to have a break for lunch first? Or do you want to have some talkies about a couple of things first?
Should we finish temporary activities at least?
I can't hear, sorry.
Should we finish temporary activities, given that we've started the
Okay.
questionings on that, or?
Yeah.
Temporary R10. I'm just wondering if point 3 should include light as well, since we've been discussing a bit about light.
In terms of the matters of discretion on the
Yes.
right-hand side?
Yes, where compliance is not achieved. Just point 3, the extent of adverse effects arising from noise and light.
Yes, I think that's a fair consideration.
Thank you.
Let's just have a look at that rule. So temporary network utilities are permitted that are required for an emergency or are related to permitted temporary activity in the chapter. So under what circumstances would they not comply and require a consent?
So if they were a temporary network utility, if a network utility wanted to have a temporary structure, temporary network utility, and it wasn't associated with an emergency, to provide an emergency service, and it wasn't related to another temporary activity. For example, at field days, one of the network utility providers, I think they needed to put up a wind turbine as like a demonstration. So in that respect, that would be permitted by this rule because it's associated with the field days temporary event. If they needed to have a temporary network utility for an other reason, then it would require a consent.
So in the case of where I live, last year some water got into an underground cable that took the power out for half a dozen houses. Is that an emergency service, or is that an event that would require a consent because they brought in a generator for about 3 weeks while they fixed their cable?
I would say that's providing an emergency service.
So I understand, yeah, if it's provided for as a temporary activity. Just wondering under what circumstances it wouldn't be an emergency if they were doing something in a rural area.
Well, there could be an instance where they need a generator for something that wasn't an emergency, in which case they might need a consent. Obviously, the rule is there to enable the utility operators to act quickly when they need to, and it's there to provide an element of temporary infrastructure for events or other temporary activities. I guess, where it doesn't meet those two requirements it would require consent unless it's not temporary, in which case it would be managed by the infrastructure chapter in general.
Is it section 310 that deals with where there's an emergency and you need a consent, but you can go ahead and do it and apply retrospectively?
Yeah,
Do you have any regard to that in drafting up this rule?
I can have a look at that, yes. Would need to confirm, but I think that section requires you to get a resource consent after the fact.
Yeah.
And that might not be the most efficient process.
Okay, so this one goes a step better, saying if it's an emergency, you don't need a consent.
Correct, yes.
Right,
It might be a scale issue as well, like you might have a smaller.
finally got there.
Joanne, just wondering, I see that out of temp 3, you took out, in regarding to storage, 1, all zones, you took out other than for farming purposes. Is that because they would need storage for longer than maybe 3 months, pertaining to likes of silage and baleage and those sorts of things, and so that'll be covered in the general rule?
Yes, so this was from a submission from Federated Farmers, which just kind of highlighted that actually by identifying storage for farming purposes in this rule, it might create confusion. So the intent of the rule was to not apply to farm for anything to do with farming purposes, but their concern was that by doing that, it sort of suggested that you couldn't have temporary storage for farming purposes. So that's why I've removed the reference, and also on the proviso though that storage of for farming purposes would be captured under your general rural primary production rule. So it in no way restricts storage for farming purposes. It was just to improve the drafting, really, so that there was no confusion around why it had identified farming purposes.
Perfect, thank you.
But really some inclusion of reference to farming purposes would not disadvantage agricultural activity, depending on how that was phrased, if it was included in temporary activities.
Yes, so originally it was included so that that temporary storage for farming purposes wouldn't be captured by the rule. But the submission kind of read it differently and was concerned that it actually meant the opposite.
So if it read, the temporary storage or stacking of goods or materials does not remain on site for longer than 3 months and does not exceed 50 in gross floor area, other than that for farming purposes, so that would be at the end rather than including. That would change the...
Yeah, bear in mind the definition of primary production says any agricultural, pastoral, horticultural activities, which includes the storage of stuff on the land. So it's part of the permitted activity rules under rural.
Okay, so it's not necessary.
No.
Righto.
And second to that is farming is not a temporary activity. Therefore, it comes under the permitted activity rule.
Because I see that in the rural rules, does not exceed 30 metres square in gross floor area rather than 50, which would be enough, wouldn't it?
I'm sorry,
If
I
it-
didn't hit the pew.
In the general rule,
Right.
I've just looked back on that and it's 30 square metres gross floor area for any storage.
Mhm.
So that would be plenty for silage.
No.
Wouldn't be. No, that's what I was sort of
Yeah,
looking
no,
back
no.
on.
But it's taken, and Keith made the point that farming's not a temporary activity.
No, but in the rural zone,
Right.
in the actual rule, it's 30 square metres storage.
It would not be sufficient at all. It's very small.
Oh, we probably need to look at that.
Yes, a question.
GR.
It's in your recommendation, the values Manawhenua whole Garden Mori Wena Whenua Wai ecosystem Mahinga Kai, their Wakapapa connections to place and the ethic of Kai Uta Kai Tai. What's that mean? Kai Uta Kai Tai. No doubt my pronunciation is not correct.
It means from the mountains to the sea. It's a concept about how everything is connected. I think the definition is actually in the policy statement for freshwater management, I think, from memory.
Concept covering from the mountains to the sea.
Yes, it's in the remanagement plan.
Right.
So they refer to this quite a lot in in the Manawhenua valleys.
Okay. In the management plan. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I've got no further questions.
So we'll take a break for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 20 minutes?
20 stretching out to 30.
Okay, so when we come back, we've got the designations to go through. Want to hear in terms of Shelley's view on the bylaw versus the district plan. We may have some questions as well, but also want to go through, I've got a list here of things we're coming back on. I would just want to compare lists as well in terms of further stuff that needs to be looked at. So it's 1:45, we'll come back just after 5:05.
We will adjourn till 2. 2. Thank you.